Tēnā koutou, ko mangatua te maunga whakaruru, ko wau, ko rain na awa, ko Ngāti Horana te iwi, ko Cecile de Klein tako ingoa. I was born in the Netherlands in the joint of two rivers, the Waal and the Rhine. But as you know, Netherlands is flat, so picking a maunga was pretty difficult. So I was lucky to immigrate 35 or 30 odd years ago to Dunedin and adopt the mangatua as my maunga. I work for the Bioeconomy Science Institute near Dunedin, and previously known AgResearch. Maybe you know it better as AgResearch, but we merged recently and are now the Bioeconomy Science Institute. And my career has been built around nitrous oxide, which is a gas, also known as laughing gas, and so named by a British 18th century scientist because of its euphoric effects, and that's possibly why you may know it a little bit better. It's a pain relief, and also it's also used as a recreational drug, and indeed you may have heard last night on the news even that it was in the news. So it was in the news last night, and there's an issue with laughing gas, but that's not why I studied it. Because I studied it because it's also a very powerful greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. And another word that we've heard quite a lot of in the media recently, particularly after this summer, where we had every 8 days we had a climate event caused by climate change. So it's important for New Zealand. And on this slide here you see the comparison of the UK emissions I've chosen as another developed country compared to New Zealand, and our profiles of greenhouse gases are quite different. So in most developed countries, carbon dioxide from industry is the key gas, and that's what people focus on reducing. However, in New Zealand, as you can see, the carbon dioxide green pie chart is smaller. The bigger ones is the orange one, which is methane. And the blue one, which is nitrous oxide, the one I study, is larger than it is in most developed countries. And that is really because our economy is based on agriculture. And methane and nitrous oxide are agricultural emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why I've studied it. And where is it coming from? So we chart of an agricultural system. I've just picked dairy here. Could have been sheep, could have been cattle, could have been anything, but there's a dairy cow. Soil nitrogen that's in the soil is used by bacteria in the soil that convert that nitrogen into nitrous oxide. And obviously nitrogen gets into the soil by fertilizers, farmer uses to grow their grass, or it also gets into the nitrogen by animals that are grazing. So the urine and dung that the animals deposit has a lot of nitrogen in it that gets into the soil. And the nitrous oxide is formed, and it is particularly formed when it rains and when the sun shines. So when it's wet and warm and there's nitrogen in the system, nitrous oxide is bigger. But nitrogen, rain and warmth are also the conditions that agriculture production needs. So a bit of a tension there. So if we reduce those conditions, that has an impact on agriculture production. So this is how it is formed. My research is focused really on two key areas. First of all, we really needed to understand how much of that nitrous oxide is produced in New Zealand agricultural systems, and secondly, what can we do about it? What are some of the solutions that we can provide farmers to reduce it? So I'll start on the first one. First, how much? This work started with the support of the Ministry for Primary Industries in the early 2000s, where we did nationwide field trials that looked a bit like this, where we had lots and lots of measurements off field, in field, where we had the buckets upside down onto the paddock where the gas was accumulating and the gas was sampled. This is how we used to do it, and sometimes still do it, really manual work, people on their knees taking gas samples, thousands and thousands of them over the years. This one here on the bottom, it's if you can see in the back, you can tell by it's slightly better resolution of photo. That's a more recent one where we now have automated chambers in the field and automated analyzers in the field that take the sample and give us the answer immediately. And it's a step forward. Anyway, that work, lots of field trials that were done, and really what we discovered in that work, that New Zealand nitrous oxide emissions were actually lower than the average values used in our global calculations. Don't know if you know, but New Zealand, under our Kyoto Protocol, our international agreements, has to submit every year an inventory or a calculation of our greenhouse gas emissions, including agricultural emissions. And there is a standard methodology that's used to calculate those emissions with standard and default factors that use those calculations. We discovered that New Zealand nitrous oxide emissions were actually lower than those standard calculations used, so it meant that we could downscale our estimates of nitrous oxide emissions quite significantly, and we've been working with the Ministry of Primary Industries quite a lot to update those emission calculations. But what also happened, because of agriculture emissions were a higher priority in New Zealand than it was in other countries, we actually did some of the pioneering work in terms of developing the methodology. And that has led to being able to leading the development of global guidelines that are published in a special issue, in a series of papers in a special issue of the Journal of Environmental Quality, so that we can compare all the emissions or the measurements that are done across the world. The results are much more consistent because we are using more similar results. So if the understanding of how much nitrous oxide is, as was I said before already, has really helped us to improve our greenhouse gas inventory that New Zealand submits every year. So we have really better proof of whether we are meeting our targets. But the same data and results have also been used to increase our on-farm accounting, or models that farmers can use to actually think, hey, where do my emissions come from and how can I target mitigations there? And then carbon footprinting, you may have heard about it as well. It's a way of assessing and assigning the carbon emissions to, or the greenhouse gas emissions to, a product. Those methodologies are also underpinned by our findings. In terms of solutions, the second part of our work, in terms of what can we do to reduce emissions, of course the easiest one is let's take nitrogen out of the system altogether. But as I said before, it's very important to have nitrogen in the system for agriculture production. So there are some options we can do and that we have studied, and as fertilizer and feed management. But the key thing that we're focused on really is on what happens in the soil, what happens with those microbes, and how can we manipulate them to actually convert less of the nitrogen that's in the soil into nitrous oxide. And work done probably about 20 or so years, or 15 to 20 years ago by colleagues at Lincoln University really showed that chemical nitrification inhibitors, and they are chemicals that we use to inhibit a certain process in the soil that results in nitrous oxide emissions, were actually very effective. But unfortunately, they had to be taken off the market because of some market access issues. But our work is now really focusing, can we do this in another way? Can we use plants to actually bring biological nitrification inhibition in the soil? So plants can exude certain compounds under certain conditions that can cause that same effect. So that's a key focus of our work at the moment. So that was the next one I want. So we have made some inroads in the whole work, but there are still challenges remaining. And the first two that I want to highlight here is the scientific challenge of emissions are hugely variable. So it's really hard to, when we're developing mitigations, to say for certain when and where they will work because of the variability in climate and soil. There's the agronomic challenge. As I said before, Agricultural production needs nitrogen, water and sunlight, and those are the conditions that nitrous oxide also is produced under. So there's always that challenge that we can't change those conditions too much, it will impact on agricultural production. But what we're doing here is really focusing on national research on these challenges, but also more and more connecting internationally. There's a numerous amount of international collaborations, established research projects, and also networks that we're using and working in. The other challenges are a little bit more harder, and they're not necessarily a scientific or a technological challenge, and that's a social challenge or economic challenge. And with the social challenge, I really mean that the things we come up with or the solutions we may provide could have an impact on agricultural production. And therefore, it's really understandably not always that palatable to the people that we want to adopt those mitigations. It's not that we are developing or discovering a new drug for a disease where everybody goes, yes, wonderful. We are actually saying maybe there's a constraint on what you can do if you want to reduce your emissions. So that's a real challenge for our work. The economic challenge is also about, we always get told, yeah, develop a new methodology or mitigation technology, but it has to be profitable. It has to, but agricultural production, and any production really, over the last 100 years, have always externalized the cost of production to the environment. And if we keep externalizing that, those environmental costs, there's always a challenge to get incentives to change. So, and it's not up to me as a scientist to say what's right or to advocate for one way or the other. What it is up to us as scientists is to provide the robust data that we then can continue to connect with our sectors and with government to develop evidence-based policy. And with that, I'll finish, and I would like to thank the Society, of course, for the enormous honor of bestowing me a fellowship to the Society. And I am very, very lucky to have huge amount of fabulous role models, mentors, peers, and team members that help me be my best. So what I want to do is I want to finish with my favorite whakatauki. E hara takatoa I te toa takatahi, engara hi toa takatini. My strength is not as an individual, but as a collective. Thank you.